Hampton, one of the co-executive directors for CPAC. Beth Reel is also with us, our other co-executive director. And for those of you who don't know CPAC, I just want to give you a quick overview. We're Connecticut's Parent Training and Information Center under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're all staffed by parents of students with disabilities, and many of our staff are on tonight. We'll be asking some questions with our division director, Bryan Klimkiewicz, who's here to speak. So one thing to know also about our agency is that we support families of children from birth to 26 with disabilities or chronic illness. And what our philosophy is that all families will have the confidence, knowledge, and understanding they need to effectively advocate for their children and to partner with professionals to ensure that children and youth grow and learn to their full potential. We are recording. We're going to put it on YouTube when we're done, and you guys will all get the link will be sent to you after the session. I'm not sure, when, within the next couple of days. We have muted everyone, and we would like to ask everyone, if you do have questions, to please put them in the chat for now, and we will monitor the chat. We will hope to have time for additional questions at the end. Two quick notices. We want folks to recognize that this is a group question opportunity. And so if you do have the chance to ask a question, please try to make it not personal and about individual students or children so that it can be meaningful to the whole group. And the last message is that we are not attorneys and we are not providing legal advice today. So we just like to remind everyone of that. And if people have individual questions or personal things that they would like to talk to us about, we'd love to talk to you. We're available during the day, during the week. You can email us at cpac@cpacinc.org or call us at 860-739-3089. So that's my opening. Now I'd like to ask Bryan Klimkiewicz if he'd like to say a few minutes before we start asking questions. Would you like to share something, Bryan, and introduce yourself to us?
Absolutely, Jane. Thank you. And thank you to the entire CPAC team. It's great to see you all and be here and be invited this evening. Looking forward to the questions and answers. And as always, I'm really anxious to hear from you, how you're doing, what your experiences have been, and how the State Department of Education can be helpful. It's hard to believe we're already almost at the end of the 2020-21 school year. It's I can't believe how quickly the calendar goes. And I know right after spring break, that time period from April to June is a flash. And there's lots of things going on. I want to thank you again. I'm extremely proud of the efforts that our parents and educators have made, and most importantly, our students in navigating the challenges this year. And so, we've been very busy at the State Department, fielding questions, collaborating with our partners at CPAC, working with our providers, our State Education Resource Center, CERC, and I see Steve on today. So Steve's here to be able to provide any resources or information. Our partners at the RESC Alliance as well. And of course, there are fabulous resources through CPAC and the supports that they provide to parents as well. I just have one update, and then we can jump right into the questions, if that's okay, Jane. I wanted to let everyone know that despite the efforts to support those around the issues related to the pandemic, our Bureau has been hard at work. I should say the State Department has been hard at work to develop the CT-SEDS module, which is the Special Education Data System. That's going to be a statewide special education system that will host and contain the new IEP document, a much improved document. And the system will be very adaptable, interactive. You've probably heard me say before that all documents within the IEP process will be translatable in the top 10 languages in the state. And if you happen to be outside of the top 10, there's a process as well to have documents translated. We're very excited about the initiative. Please look to CERC and CPAC for information related to parent training, and your districts will also be working with you to make sure that you understand the changes for the new draft IEP document. There's it's such an improved document in the flow and in the information and the way that's laid out, it's going to be easier to understand for both parents and students, and really easier for our practitioners to implement as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions around that. The timeline for this new system is that it will be launched in all districts on July 1st, 2022. So a little over a year from now. And as you can imagine, over the course of the next year, there will be training and technical assistance, and quite a few of our districts will be piloting the system next year. That doesn't mean they're running two systems necessarily, but it means that they'll be testing out the system and kind of making sure that it's doing what it's been designed to do. So again, very excited. We do have a direct link on our website for information and video tutorials and so forth. So I just wanted to mention that, Jane, before we get started with the questions. But I'm happy to be here, and hope everyone's doing well.
Thanks, Brian. We do have different staff. We're going to ask different questions, but I have the first two. So everyone knows, you had the opportunity to put questions in when you registered, and so we did get some questions. We tried to combine a few to try to hit all the topics that were submitted. So the first two are a little bit more quicker. The first one, Brian, was, has the mask requirement changed for schools, or do you see a change coming?
Yeah, so the mask, the mitigation strategies for the pandemic, including distancing and wearing of masks, has not changed. Of course, districts are working with their local departments of health on all of the required safety mitigation strategies that are in place. I know that the Department of Public Health is making decisions and sharing information, as they're looking at data and as they're looking at information, new information that's coming in, as vaccines are rolled out and more people are being vaccinated. There still is the mask requirement for schools. Of course, there are mask exemptions that are in place, and we know schools work to make those types of accommodations. So it's hard to predict if the DPH has weekly calls in collaboration with the State Department of Education on Tuesdays and on Tuesday mornings. And you'll often hear the leaders in the Department of Public Health talking about that, you can't predict the course. They're kind of working in chunks of time where they're taking the information, and that course causes challenges for schools that are planning for school next year, planning for summer services, for parents, that want to know a little bit more long-term and how to plan for those types of things. But at this point in time, those mitigation strategies are still in place in schools. They've been very effective in schools. Again, there's been a tremendous amount of effort, and that effort has paid off in controlling, to the extent that we can, the spread of the virus within the school systems.
Thanks. And I would think that part of the governor's message would be, if those get lifted, we'll hear about it. He has lifted the outside mask mandate, of May 1st, I believe. So do you think that the announcement would come from him?
I think that would be a similar announcement, Jane, that you mentioned, that would either come from the governor's office or directly from the Department of Public Health on behalf of the governor, and some type of collaborative communication. Okay,
thank you. So the second question we had for you, which is a very, very popular question in our office, is, will remote education, special education services continue to be an option next year in the same way it is now? For example, families who have significant health concerns or significant behavioral concerns, who may find that this was more productive and healthy for them.
Right. Yeah, this is a question that we received quite a bit, Jane, especially recently. Again, as I mentioned, as districts are planning for their extended school year services, as parents are concerned, it's a hotly debated topic on either end of the spectrum. Of course, we're always encouraging in-person instruction to the extent that that can be done safely, and we continue to know that the in-person delivery of education and instruction is so effective, and so I can tell you this. I can say that the governor's office, the Department of Public Health, and the State Department of Education are working on this information to be able to give specific directives around this for school districts and to parents. I also wanted to mention there's two legislative proposals, Senate Bill 2 and Senate Bill 977, so that address this issue, and it's still unknown as to how those bills will work themselves through or not, or be revised or not. So right now we know that option is in place, and my colleague from the academic office, Irene Parisi, who's the chief academic officer, reminds us of the lexicon what we're using, and to say, virtual learning has been in place before the pandemic and will continue to be in place. And certain strategies for instruction and having students have access and all of those positives that have come out of this type of situation. Districts are going to work hard to continue those practices. Families need to work hard to advocate for those processes. We've heard from parents about students that have made tremendous progress within a remote instruction. And then we've also heard the other opposite end of the spectrum of students that cannot access for whatever reason. So there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of stakeholder input being considered within this determination. But I do think that will be another announcement, Jane, that will be in the very near future coming from the governor's office.
Oh, great. Thank you. Lynn, would you like to introduce yourself and ask the next question?
Hi, so I'm Lynn Rule. I'm a parent consultant with the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center. And Brian, I want to piggyback off of what Jane was, and you were just talking with Jane about in terms of students who had not been making progress. So we want to take a look at students who did not necessarily make progress, students who were losing out on some of their service hours due to the pandemic. We've had questions from parents who still are looking back to last year, believe it or not, last March, that they still have time that is owed to them. So the question comes in, how are parents supposed to be progressing through this? So on that skill recovery piece, are they looking at ESY? Are they looking at service hours that are owed to them? And I'm saying this, with parenthetically, because we know that skill recovery is not necessarily looked at the same way as compensatory services. We were looking at those differently last year. So how has that changed and evolved over the course of these last 13, 14 months since this pandemic began?
Thank you, Lynn. So there's quite a bit of content in there.
Yep.
So I'm going to do my best, but I think we can chunk it out rather than me, talking for a long period of time and try to follow up. First of all, we always start by saying the IDEA requirements, there was no relief from them. The IDEA requirements are all in place from the start all the way through the pandemic. And but there is a difference between the March through June versus July 5th, when school building closures were directed by the governor from March through June. And then as of the 5th, that there was an order to say that in-person learning could continue. And so that concept of to the greatest extent possible change to IEPs being fully implemented, whether it be in-person, remote, or a combination thereof. So, a couple things that I think to center this conversation is we have to maintain high expectations for all of our students. We always have to champion our students' learning and the gaps that our students have in that journey to make sure that those gaps are closed. Mm-hmm. The last thing that we want to have happen is any type of a gap broadened or widened or any type of regression. And having said that, we want to make sure that our students don't feel pressured to catch up or make up, or that something wrong happened and that, that they're, not as well off as they were, or those pieces. So we have to make sure that we, in the language that we use and in the processes that we use, that the child is at the center, their social emotional needs and the balance. And who better to be the protectors of that than our parents and families who know the students the best and know what, where's the breaking point, how much direct instruction is possible versus play and camps and fun social opportunities, and how do you balance all of those pieces to ensure that that whole child is considered. And then really the process needs to be collaborative and not a us versus them or a dispute, because as we know, the IDA is not written for a pandemic.
Right.
It's written for typical conditions. So if we look to the law is silent on this, and people are making determinations the best that they can. So a couple things I wanted to share is, one, there's a document called Accelerate CT. About a month ago, the governor held a conference with the commissioner. Senator Murphy was on that call, as well as a variety of stakeholders to be able to provide input on what's happening for schools. And the theme is CT Accelerate, which is a proactive, positive mindset. Not to say, kids, you're behind, you're at deficit, you need to be filled. That's not the message. The message is, kids, where are you now? How are you doing? What do you need to accelerate to move forward? So that general education document provides the context for students with IEPs and or students with 504 plans. So there were 5 groups, breakout groups: family and community, academics, social emotional learning, summer enrichment, digital divide, and technology, that same. And those groups really work to be able to frame a process and a system that parents can understand and districts can understand, because this is an unprecedented time in the country where we have billions of dollars coming into education, including special education. So this is not a time where funding is at question. There are funds to be able to support these recovery, acceleration, these enrichment activities to try to mitigate what the impact of the pandemic was.
So
within that, go ahead, Lynn.
No, go ahead.
This is a good time for me to pause.
So within that context, when you are looking at skill recovery, so we are looking at some maybe speech services or OT services, or all important, I think, during these last 13 months, counseling services that students maybe had missed out on, and some of those opportunities to really be able to meet their needs. We're finding that some of it's not being met, or met necessarily with fidelity when it's being done virtual. So where are parents to head in that direction? Is that all coming under your the Accelerate plan that you were discussing?
Yeah, it'll be a part of it, Lynn, and we're trying to help. We know teams have been working on this. We know it's April already, and there's been a lot of work and a lot of discussions and a lot of agreement on this. We know some students have been in person since September 1, and their IEPs have been implemented and they've been making progress. We know other students that have been disengaged and remote, and their skills have, the both ends of the spectrum. So, not all students will need that, but we need still to be able to provide a process for families and districts to be able to follow. So that will be part of the guidance that's coming out. And I like to think of it in, kind of 3 different buckets in that. And I'm hopeful to be able to share this document with you all in the very near future. Not sure the exact timeline, but it will certainly, it's certainly a priority for the commissioner to get this information out and ensure that we have all of the stakeholder feedback on these documents. But the first concept is making sure our students with IEPs can access what's happening in the general ed. So if the district's doing a summer camp or a summer enrichment program, social outings in the community, connecting with community partners, the aquarium, down in Southern Connecticut, or library services. We want to make sure our students with IEPs have access to those activities. They may need new accommodations, they may need modifications, they may need support to be able to access those. So that's one piece. The second piece is what you were talking about, and this parent may be concerned about, is regression of skills. So we need PPTs to come together to establish where is the student, what present levels are they currently at, what data do we use to be able to do that. Then there's a comparison between where that student was, for example, prior to the pandemic. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ed Benefit process, but it's a way of looking at IEPs across years to ensure the students making meaningful benefiting from those IEP services. And then it's making determinations of, what is it that student needs to be able to achieve the goals and objectives that were designed. Is their progress line like this? Is it like this, or is it like this? And there's a different plan for each, if you will. But teams, if you don't have a present levels established, then you're not making decisions based on data. And so that's a really important aspect of what the teams are going to do. So I'm confident that our guidance document will describe this process so that, and we've had input from the team at CPAC, as well as other stakeholders in this, to make sure that we're, that we can, it's the best product that it can be before that it is released, and addresses all the issues that it needs to. It's not a cure-all or an end-all to a lot of the challenging situations. Sorry, so the first one is accessing general ed. The second one is making sure PPTs have a process to establish present levels. And then the last piece is, the concept of compensatory education is still a concept. That means that FAPE was not provided. So if a parent feels, or if a school feels that FAPE was not provided because of the impact of the pandemic, then that the PPT can get together to say, because speech and language wasn't delivered from X date to X date, here was the impact on the student. What's our remedy to make sure that the student's whole, based on where they would have been had those services been provided? So that's a different level of looking at a student's growth. And that could happen through the dispute resolution process, where it's either a hearing officer or a complaint investigator that's making these types of compensatory determinations. But there's nothing stopping PPTs from collaborating and coming together and determining what those services look like moving forward.
So I want to kind of segue into my favorite topic, which is the Learning Model IEP, or as you said, the LMIP. And many districts, we've had a lot of questions about this, where some districts had provided one, some districts maybe had not, whether or not those were followed. But what happens to that document now? So this was created as a way to determine how they were going to provide service during the pandemic. What happens to it now, and what happens to it moving forward? Is this something that districts will be advised to continue to create in the event that we do have a situation? And now that we're moving back full time, you have situations where students perhaps have, we've lost him. Did he disappear?
Brian, you're muted and you're.
I'm here. I'm here.
There you are. Okay.
Yeah.
So now that students are going back full time, a lot of students are going back full time. If they do have to quarantine and back and forth. So what do we do now with these lovely LMIPs? The Learning Model IEP implementation.
The LMIPs, right? Everything needs an acronym. That's a horrible acronym. So it was funny. I was sharing just before the call that one of the district calls them lime pies, which I thought was really creative instead of LMIPs. Yeah, that's a great question, Lynn. So, the pandemic really, one of the recommendations from the previous federal guidance was that school districts could implement IEPs in person or remote or a combination thereof, in with the impact of the safety requirements. So what Connecticut did was we created a tool to help districts and parents understand how the IEP was going to be implemented if the student wasn't in person. So ideally, the concept is best utilized as a contingency plan. So if we need this, if for some reason school is closed or the building is inaccessible, how is that student going to access their IEP? And if you have a contingency plan, then schools are prepared, parents are prepared, and the student doesn't miss a beat, so to speak. Even though, of course, we always say in person is ideal, for us to all be back in school. So that there's questions about the LMIAP to say, if a student's quarantined or if something happens temporarily, should there be a plan for that remotely? And the answer is yes. I mean, that's why the tool was designed, to be able to ensure that the IEP is implemented across those types of issues that would crop up. Now, it's as we were going through the school year, it was difficult for districts to pivot short term, even within, let's say they were hybrid, then they had to go fully remote. How are we going to do this? And so, I always said, initially when we started in August, at the State Department, we would expect to see LMIIP plans that would have a scenario for hybrid, a scenario for full in-person, and then utilize those as you need them to go through the process. So it's more proactive than reactive.
Right.
Once all kids are back in school, there isn't a need to have it, except as a contingency plan. So we really need to help people transition to that point or understand that point. But having said that, I mentioned the CT SEDS system to start out. We're actually building in an implementation plan into this system. God forbid, just in case something happens down the line, or who knows, there's a hurricane, there's a tornado,
Right.
School buildings are out, there's a fire, any type of natural disaster can happen where kids may find themselves. And I also believe that students with, for example, really medically complex needs, students that are homebound, students that are in hospitalization situations, how tremendous it is to have them have live access to classrooms and those types of things that are happening. We don't want to lose those advantages that we've had, even when we're beyond the pandemic. So our hope is that PPTs will continue to access and to utilize those individual determinations for students, because anything that's good for kids should be a part of the PPT process, should be part of the discussion and the part of the determinations. So I hope I answered that question fully, but it was new. We knew there would be inconsistencies in how they were written. For example, the State Department, we didn't provide a lot of guidance around it. We sent it out with written instructions. We didn't, if there were ideal conditions, we would have trained teams and trained trainers and, had videos and examples and all of those pieces. We do have, we have been looking at and reviewing plans to see where there were misconceptions or misunderstandings so that we can correct that moving forward, and to provide exemplars, for example, to districts for pre-K kids, students in middle school, and our young adults in the high school. But we acknowledge that this was done quickly, that that there were issues along the way, but we know that OSEP looked at our plans and said that our plans were consistent with the IDA. So we were relieved to hear that, because in the absence of guidance, we're working in the best interests of students and making these decisions the best that we can.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Vanessa now. So thank you, Bryan.
Thank you.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for having me here too. I'm a
Hi.
parent consultant with the CPAC as well, and I have a question. If a family has exhausted their effort at collaboration and feel they need to use disputed resolution option, what is the timetable for resolving the issues under each type of, including the complaints, mediation, and due process hearing, and what might be the time least method to resolve their issue?
Thank you, Vanessa, for that question. I'll start with the complaint process. So it is a requirement for the State Department of Education to investigate complaints and to complete those complaints in a 60-day timeframe. Sometimes that's done earlier. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't meet our deadlines, even though that is a requirement. So we strive to meet those 60-day timelines. There are allowable extensions to that timeline for extenuating circumstances, which happens occasionally. But for the most part, a parent can expect a 60-day process. So, that's a relatively lengthy amount of time if a parent wants something resolved immediately or short term. The mediation process really is if there's agreement between the parent and the district to set up a mediation, then it's just a matter of scheduling that mediation. And then what we tell parents is to expect a full day of mediation and mediating and coming to hopefully a resolution at the end of that day where both sides are in agreement and there's a written resolution to that. For due process hearings, those really vary in length of time depending on the outcome. We've had due process cases that have been as long as a year, and 6 months, is probably the average amount of time from start to finish, especially in fully adjudicated, meaning it's going all the way through the process for the hearing officer, and there's no, resolution prior to that. So that can be a very lengthy process to be able to come to resolution. But what I would say is that, if the parent is at the point where they feel like they've tried to collaborate, tried to come to an agreement, please reach out to the State Department of Education and call the Bureau of Special Education, because we can informally try to resolve issues, provide you with resources, provide you with information proactively. Call CPAC, make sure CPAC understands what the situation is that you're facing. CPAC will be able to advise you what the best route is. And CPAC has a lot of programs to be able to work with parents and district to make sure the communication flow, that there's understanding on both sides, that to try to get to what the issue is to be able to resolve it. But our consultants within the Bureau, I would recommend calling, making sure that they're aware of what the issue is. They'll be able to provide you with advice and information. And we can also speak to the district on a parent's behalf if they're willing to do that. We've done that, keeping the parents anonymous if there's some type of a larger issue or a larger question. But we've also called on behalf of the parents if they're okay with us doing that.
Thanks, Bryan. Thanks, Vanessa. I think we're going to move on to Laura. Is this your question next, Laura?
Yes, it is my question. Good afternoon, Bryan. My name is Laura Knapp, and I'm one of the parent consultants at CPAC. And I'm going to switch gears to the older students. So for students who have or are aging out, if they have not had any type of work experience for the past year, can a family request service?
So Laura, your audio was kicking in and out. So maybe you want to repeat the question?
Sure, I will repeat it. Can you hear me? No. Okay, great. For students who have or are aging out and have not had any type of work experience for the past year, can a family request services beyond age 22?
Awesome, thank you. As you probably are all aware of the ruling that took place that superseded the current state statute around reaching maximum age of eligibility for services, Students now, if they're not exited by receiving a regular high school diploma, that maximum age of eligibility is their 22nd birthday. So IEP is being implemented until the day before they turn 22. Our adult agencies are ready and shifted their processes to ensure that adult supports, if the student's eligible, are in place on that 22nd birthday and then moving forward. So there is no extended eligibility for students after they turn 22. That's the maximum age. However, what I'll say is that, this year, I mentioned a little bit earlier during the first question, is that IEPs are required to be implemented. And whether that's remotely or in person, that is a requirement. If you feel as though your IEP was not implemented, you can request a PPT to talk about your concerns. And then, of course, if there's a disagreement at the PPT, a parent also always has the rights to dispute resolution through the procedural safeguards that are provided to you. About the work-related experiences, what we would have expected to happen is if, because of the pandemic, there was an issue with accessing community supports or work-related experiences, that the PPT would design a plan to ensure that those goals and objectives were addressed in a different way. So they may not look the same as they were designed prior to the pandemic, but those adjustments can happen. And that's a discussion between the parent, between the student, and the young adult and the school-based team. So that would be my recommendation, is to go back to the PPT, discuss those types of concerns. If you feel like FAPE was not provided, you have rights around that. And compensatory services can be provided after a student turns 22, but their eligibility ends at the age of 22. It's different than students that are younger.
Great, thank you. And I think now it's back to you, Lynn, for questions. Is that correct?
Oh, I guess it was going back to me. Yep. So we're going to go to back to the other end of the spectrum, which is the little guys, and talk a little bit about pre-K and the question about the remote evaluation process that had to take place for those young guys. So we have been hearing from some parents that some of the evaluations that were conducted were perhaps not as comprehensive as they would have been, obviously, if it had been all in person. In particular, we look at the observation with peers to measure social skills and social communications. So what can parents do about this? Can they request additional evaluations if they feel that the district has left some of the, has not been able to fulfill some of that, or how should they handle that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, even though it's designated for our youngest learners, it really has implications across all years, because, what a challenge for evaluations this year, right? I know districts and parents have been working to ensure, the practitioners are concerned about fidelity of, these tools weren't designed to be, certain tools weren't designed to be delivered or administered remotely, and they're doing the best that they can. They're gathering the information the best that we can, but an evaluation in normal conditions can't be replicated in what we've been experiencing this past year. It has to be a combination of in-person, out-of-person, remote, using all the information that we have, getting input from parents, getting input from the team members. I know evals have happened in person and schools have been open and those types of situations. I know young learners, and it sounds like in this parent's concerned about a remote evaluation that took place and feeling like it wasn't as comprehensive as they need to be. So what I would advise is to go back to PPT. It's very fact dependent in this individual case, but was the student not eligible because of that information? And is there a concern about eligibility? There's one sort of road for that. Was the student determined eligible, but the parent feels like all the needs weren't met in the IEP because they weren't able to look at certain pieces? There's a little bit of a different process for that. But the advice would be to handle both of those situations, go back to the district, go back to PPT and communicate your concerns to the district and, try to work through that. And as always, parents could always reach out to the state or CPAC to help with some of those more detailed nuances within the process. But we're really concerned about our youngest learners. The school population decreased significantly for pre-K and K this year. We have lots of young ones home, like no other year. So that that's a concern overall, and we're hoping to get them all. I know my wife works in pre-K, and her class was in person all year. It was one of the districts where they were from day one in person throughout the whole process, but I know that wasn't the case in all communities.
Right.
And it's very dependent on. So
And I just wanted to jump in since you guys are on this topic. There was a question in the chat about retention for preschool. Yeah, okay, I didn't know if everybody saw it. So, given the year that we've had, what about retention in preschool for some kids? That is there are parents who are asking us that question.
Or kids that will turn 5 before January and not wanting to put them into kindergarten at this point in time, not being prepared for kindergarten.
Yeah, so we have some wonderful resources, and I wish Andrea Burnell were on this call here, but we do have some wonderful resources for parents about that question, in that, that the IEP may not be implemented if parents choose to keep their child in pre-K rather than advancing to kindergarten. And we try to help parents understand that the IEPs are designed to support the student and having them be able to access the general curriculum. And but I know those are difficult decisions for parents. But we can absolutely share that resource with you all and make sure that you have a chance to look at that and digest that. But there would be ramifications to potentially to IDA eligibility for parents that choose to retain their students in pre-K rather than having an advance to kindergarten.
How about retention for other grades? And we've been talking tonight about skill recovery and not making progress and so forth, and accessing the curriculum and having access to all the services that are necessary. So say a 3rd grader to a 4th grade, or, you look at that curriculum leap from 2nd to 3rd grade, which is pretty significant. If a student has not been making progress and parents are really looking toward retention, I know that's not really a word that school districts necessarily want to use, but would it be looked at differently in the event of what we've gone through this past year?
So what I'll say this for retention, talk to your school, talk to your teams about, there are research-based pros and cons to retention. And we want to make sure families understand the benefit and as well as the potential, what's the opposite of benefit? It's getting late in the day. It's getting late in the day. Pros and cons, yeah. The benefits and the possible detriments to the student in the research around those pieces. I haven't heard a lot of calls around retention this year. I heard more last year, actually, from March. I don't know if that's the case. I'm sure it's on some parents' minds, especially, students that really had disruptive years, right, or years where they were unable to access. It's a lot easier really to think about it at the high school level when you think about how many credits a student earned. Are they at freshman status? Are they at sophomore status? How many credits have they earned? And it's a challenging discussion for, for students that, like you said, in elementary level or middle school level, but your school-based teams should be able to provide recommendations in what they feel would be in the best interest of your student, the child, the young adult. And parents should also share their concerns about why they think retention is the right answer. And then if you're doing that and having those conversations openly, we'd be concerned with like a a response from a school-based team that just, yep, no, we're not going to talk about that. Let's go over here. That's really not helpful, and it seems to like create more of a divide. So it's being able to look at the data, talk about the concerns, and hopefully come to a resolution on that. But we haven't, like I said, from the special education perspective on things, we mostly hear that at the pre-K level, which is why Andrea Burnell, who works at the Bureau of Special Education, our 619 and pre-K coordinator, has worked hard on some resources to make sure parents understand why those rules are in place and to be able to make informed decisions.
And just to make a note, Adriana, who is our early childhood programs manager, put her email address in the chat. So anybody who's a parent of a young child can also reach out to Adriana. Thank you, Adriana.
And then we also have a question regarding LD guidelines, learning disabilities guidelines, to be updated given the impact of COVID and the interruption in school and how those factors impact instruction overall.
Yes. Yeah, so the LD guidelines, which also include the dyslexia, information on dyslexia as a separate category under the larger umbrella of learning disability guidelines, are being worked on currently. And we are hopeful that even through the pandemic that they will be released in the near future. Our goal is to try to have those guidelines out for the start of the next school year. And we've had teams, and Steve knows, he's collaborated, and we've had teams at CERC working on the guidelines with us, and tapped into reading specialists across the state and practitioners across the state. And Alicia Trachis, who's the Bureau of Special Education lead consultant for dyslexia, has picked up the torch on this to move it forward. And, I'll just say this too, Lynn, as you know, the general education interventions are so integral and important when trying to determine, is the student's lack of progress because of a lack of appropriate instruction, or is it because of a disability related challenge that student's having? So special education guidelines are only as good as the guidelines around general education interventions, universal screenings that are in place, picking up students quickly that are at risk, and making sure that they have the support and the teaching that they're going to be able to respond to and be responsive to. So the state Department of Education and the Board of Education is working on their 5-year strategic plan. And what is more important than reading for our students in Connecticut? I mean, that is really critical and the key. And we have a long way to go. I mean, we have lots of students that are struggling, that aren't able to read at grade level, or are significantly behind, or aren't able to read at all. So we really need to address those issues. And I know that the guidelines will help provide a framework around that. And I think, the pandemic has highlighted a lot of issues in the state that we've had. We do a lot of things well, but it's also accentuated some of the areas that we really need to improve. And one of them for sure is to ensure that all students are readers and are literate and are, have that foundation moving forward, because it's so critical. So long story short, again, that we're really hopeful that unless some extenuating situation occurs, we would expect those guidelines to be rolled out for the start of next school year.
Great, thank you so much.
So Brian, we have 2 more questions. We have 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask one that might be quicker, and then Vanessa's going to ask the last one, which mine is, with the state's pilot and expansion to 100 districts using the DESA, which for people listening, that's the social emotional screening tool that's been approved. When can those students with 504s or IEPs expect to see any identified areas or goals, objectives from that screener?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Glenn Peterson, who is my counterpart in a different office in student services, spearheaded this initiative where the DESA will be provided at no cost to districts across the state. It's being piloted next year and then expanded across the state over the next 2 or 3 years. And as Jane mentioned, it's a universal screening to ensure that students' social emotional needs are being met. And like any other screening, it's one piece of information that puts together a larger, puzzle or a larger picture of where the student's functioning. And so that data and information for students with 504 plans or IEPs should be brought into that process. So it sounds like the parents saying, when can we expect to see? If the school is administering that universal assessment and they're utilizing that tool, then in an IEP, you should expect to see where that student is in that present level section of the IEP. 504 is a little different in that 504 plans are all about accommodations and how the student can access their general education curriculum. So in a 504 discussion, it may come out around eligibility when you're determining whether or not a student has a disability that affects one of the major life functions and requires an accommodation plan, or it may result in some accommodations or perhaps even a related service that student would need to be able to access the general ed curriculum. So there are districts that already have the DESA in place and are paying for it, but the state has made a commitment to provide that universal screening across for free at no cost to districts. And that will happen over the next 3 years.
So it's going to vary depending on where the district is in the application. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be next year, it could be the year after, or worst case scenario in 2023.
So the last question Vanessa has, and it's yet a different pivot to a whole new topic. So Vanessa, if you want to go ahead.
Yes. Children who have the diagnosis of autism often will get the classification of developmental delay at the intake PPT. How this determined, and does this make a difference in the services that could be available for parents and their children?
That's a great question, Vanessa. Thank you. Yeah, so in Connecticut, we have a category of eligibility called developmental delay, which needs to be changed no later than the student's 6th birthday. So that's a requirement where all PPTs, if your student's turning 6, that developmental delay category is no longer appropriate. As far as we like to say, and we really believe that no matter what the primary disability category checkbox is for that student, that really the important part is the plan. It's the program, the IEP, Individualized Education Program. Does it contain the right information and present levels? Is the student receiving the specialized instruction that they need? Are they receiving the services they need? And so that should not be dependent on the primary disability category, even though the primary disability category opens the door to special education's, services and supports and so forth. So I will say this topic is important. We have some work to do, I think, in the eligibility processes overall. And again, the pandemic has kind of shined a light on our processes and our eligibility determinations and making sure that evals are comprehensive in looking at all areas. There was some whispers about legislation this year about this very category, developmental delay. It's interesting that the federal requirement for developmental delay goes all the way up to age 9. So some states it's age 9, Connecticut it's before age 6. I talked to some of my colleagues from other states and they're in between. But the important piece here is that the plan itself and contains the information, contains the data and the services that the student needs.
I just want to hop in for a minute. I'm going to launch a poll that has an evaluation as we continue to wrap up. If there are any other questions or comments, we can look in the chat.
Are we going to find out if people like my answers or not?
That's exactly what they're going to say, Brian.
I should probably look away. but really, thank you. I want to thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all this evening and talk about these topics. And I'm hopeful we can do it again in the near future. I mentioned the guidance documents that are coming out in the near future, so I'd love to do a follow-up once families have had an opportunity to read and digest the guidance that's coming out and moving forward.
Well, we had so many questions that we were just thinking that we would invite you to come back in a couple of weeks.
I do want to answer that one question in the chat, which was just to name the screener again. And the acronym is DESSA. I don't know what it stands for. Do you, Brian?
Yes, it's the Devereaux emotion. Shoot. I'll get that to you for you in a second. I don't have it off the top of my head, but yeah.
The acronym is DESSA, and I imagine you can Google it and get an answer to that.
Yes.
But thank you. Thanks, Christine.
DESSA is fine.
Yeah. Any other wrap-ups? Anybody else want to add anything? We will come back when we have the guidance and pick Brian's brain on what it all means and try to get a better understanding. So for tonight, thank you everyone for coming, and you can reach out to CPAC or the Bureau. The numbers are in the chat, and let us know what you need. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve, you're muted, but thank you. That's Steve's favorite thing. He likes to be muted.
We're still live.
Okay.
Right.